It is now my pleasure to introduce, in his 6th term in Congress, our very own representative for our district, Congressional District Number 2, our very own Jim Matheson. He made the comment, one that really sticks in our mind, that one of the greatest threats that we face to our economy and to energy is our dependency on foreign oil. And that really stuck with me, and I appreciate the position that he's taking on developing and supporting our extraction industry. And so if you would, please give a warm welcome to our Congressional Representative Jim Matheson.
How you doing? I got to tell you, my favorite thing about this conference so far is when they wrote the program, I noticed that for my good friend and colleague Rob, that you gave him the title Congressman Rob Bishop. Knowing how people feel about Congress these days, I'm glad you just listed me as Jim Matheson. I'm okay not having the Congress title. Listen, I know you've had a long day and probably heard a lot of good information, and I would like to, I guess I'm the closing act, so I'd like to make sure that responsive to what your interests are, and I will not give a super long set of remarks. I'm happy more to just take some questions, but I'll offer just a couple of opening comments. First, I think it's great that the county took the initiative to put this together, and I think it's great to get people in the same room talking. I see a lot of friends in this room because what I've learned during my time in office is that when I've met with representatives of the energy industry, I always learn something. And we've had good dialogue when we talk about the issues and the challenges that you face every day. And it's helped guide me in terms of how I behave in Congress. I want to mention a couple of things I've been working on that I think are instructive in terms of how we need to approach some of these issues right now. The House of Representatives just last week voted on a bill that I wrote along with a guy named John Sullivan, who's a Republican from Oklahoma. I always do my bills in a bipartisan way, and the two of us wrote a bill called the Train Act. You may have heard of this. The Train Act was named the Train Act after something that people perceive as an upcoming train wreck. And the train wreck is these 6 different EPA rules that are all coming down the pike. This is primarily for the electric utility industry, admittedly, so this is not exactly for oil and gas industry, but it's instructive of where EPA is these days. And the point is that when EPA promulgates a rule, by its own criteria, it looks at the impacts of the rule, looks at the economic impacts and other impacts of these rules. But the problem that I learned about from listening to folks who were trying to figure out how to respond to these rules when they come out is that they look at an individual rule. They're kind of the group that's looking at that rule looks in a stovepipe in that rule. And they don't look at any of the others. It's the old cliche, you're looking at each tree, but they're not taking that one step back to look at the forest. And people saw these 6 rules coming down the pike, and the timing in which they came down or whatnot would have given industry a confusing set of criteria for how to make decisions. They might make decisions to invest in one direction based on if some of these rules came down a certain way. But then if other rules came down later, they said, oh man, that was a waste of money we just did here. We would have actually, if we'd known this, we would have gone a different direction. And so the concept is pretty simple behind the Train Act, and that is we should take a look at this before we leap into this. And we should really require the Environmental Protection Agency to take a step back and consider the impacts of the cumulative set of all these rules. Because I think it will be very telling in terms of the economic impacts and other impacts on consumers, on industry, and quite frankly, even on the regulators. I think the regulators ought to want to know what the impact of this whole basket of rules is together. And so this legislation passed the House of Representatives just last week in a bipartisan way, and I was really happy with that, and I hope that the United States Senate takes that bill up sooner than later, although they don't, in case you hadn't noticed, they don't move many bills we pass in the House these days, so we will see. Let me just offer a couple of other thoughts. We are coming out of the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. And I think that should be the #1 public policy issue that people are looking at is economic growth and job creation. And in my personal opinion, over the last 2 or 3 years in Washington, D.C., that has not necessarily been the #1 agenda. And quite candidly, I will make that criticism at various levels to leadership of both political parties. They've been talking about other issues. They haven't been talking about that issue. Now, I don't think government should be running our economy. I don't think there's any quick fix or some magic law Congress can pass, but there are steps we can take. And one subset of those issues happens to be reflected in this room. It has to do with energy policy and opportunities to create economic opportunity and growth and job creation in this country. I think that, in fact, there are great opportunities in that subset of the overall economic development agenda in Washington. First of all, I think it makes no sense to discourage investment by repealing the tax credits that support domestic energy production. I have joined a bipartisan group of folks in the House who specifically signed on to a letter opposing the administration's proposal to raise taxes on domestic energy producers. I know it may sound politically popular at times to beat up on what they call big oil, but you in this room know as well as I do that a significant, in fact, most of all those in the industry are actually smaller businesses, the independents, who historically have invested so much back into the business. At whatever cash flow you're getting, you're putting it back in, which is a good thing for our economy, by the way. And why would we want to discourage that? That doesn't make sense to me, particularly in a time of an economic downturn, but even in general, it doesn't make sense to me. And so I want to reiterate that to you, that I feel pretty strongly about that issue. I've communicated many times during the last couple of years with the Department of Interior about proposals that I feel have not been warranted. I joined with the rest of the Utah congressional delegation, all 5 of us, have communicated in written form that we oppose any type of top-down type of process in terms of public lands discussions in Utah. We think the bottom-up approach with local stakeholders is the appropriate way to go. And we have a model in place that showed that that works in terms of the legislation that I co-authored with Senator Bennett for Washington County. And I think that that is a more appropriate to get Utahns sitting around the table talking about this, not folks in Washington. I just think we need to be sure that as we try to move forward and make this economy go again, we recognize how critical our domestic energy production capabilities can be in being an important part, not only of economic growth and opportunity, but also in terms of making our country politically stronger. Because I'll close with this and then open up to questions. You'll hear elected officials talk about energy independence all the time. Hear it all the time. And my suggestion to you, if you ever hear someone running for elective office or in office talking about energy independence, ask them how they're really going to address the issue. How do they really want to solve that problem? Because quite frankly, the oil embargo, 1973 oil embargo, was 38 years ago. 38 years ago is when we first were given a signal that our country had a vulnerability, if you will, to this reliance on foreign supply. And you know what happened in those last 38 years? I mean, a lot happened in those last 38 years, but one thing that happened is our reliance on imported oil went from 30% we used to about 60%. We went the wrong way. We were given a signal 38 years ago, and what we have done in response is go the wrong direction in terms of reliance on foreign supply. Now, I get it. Quite frankly, over a lot of those 38 years, prices have been pretty cheap. There's not been a lot of market incentives to really create alternatives. We've done pretty well as a country during a lot of that time on this issue. Those days are gone. And in my opinion, while there are many ways to address the energy independence issue, let me offer my suggestion for what we should be doing in the public policy world. There's a short-term and a long-term dynamic to this. In the short term, it's pretty clear. You increase domestic production, number one, onshore and offshore. That's the first thing you do. Second thing you do is you pass the legislation in Congress called the Natural Gas Act, which I think makes a significant commitment to have natural gas as at least a significant component of our transportation fuel mix. On-the-shelf technology, got a Chevy parked right outside the building I saw when I walked in, natural gas vehicle. Domestic resource, plentiful supply, again, would make a real impact on reducing our reliance on foreign oil. That's your short, maybe short and mid-term ideas for that. Longer term, you want to look for other ideas, other technologies. The first two don't require any technological innovation. That's what's exciting. It's ready to go. There's some infrastructure challenges, but you don't need technology to develop. They are on the shelf and ready to go. Then you got to get to the next level for long term that may require other choices. And I don't know exactly what they're going to be, and I don't think Congress should be picking winners and losers, although I may contradict myself because I'm for the Natural Gas Act. But in the long run, is it where we find ways, and we should truly invest more and more in our research and development efforts to encourage the development of our oil shale and tar sands resources? Yeah, that's another option. Clearly about to be on the table. That may be closer than we think. Should we be looking at electric vehicle technology? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a put it all on the table guy. I'm all for in the future, we want all those options out there. But if you really want to have an answer to energy independence now, look at the first two I mentioned. And it doesn't mean you take it down to 0% or imports per se, but every increment of 10%, let's say, just to throw out a number, is a big deal. It's a big deal for our economy in terms of spending money domestically and not shipping what is right now about $1 billion a day going offshore to buy oil. $1 billion a day. I still think that's a lot of money. Maybe I work in a town where people don't think that's a lot of money. I think that's a lot of money. And it goes beyond economics, quite frankly. It goes to America's political capabilities in the world. And reducing that reliance on various unstable regions of the world is good politics, too. It's good policy outside of the economy. So to me, that's the direction that we ought to pursue, and that's certainly the direction that I have advocated. I said I was going to give very brief remarks, and I've gone a little longer than I did, but I'm happy to do what you guys would like, and happy to take questions or do whatever you want. So happy to open up and see what people want to talk about. First one's the toughest at the end of the day, I know. But sneeze you, hey. Thank you. Thanks.
On the chances for survival?
Very good question based on what's going on right now. In terms of the super committee, I'll repeat the question. He just said, look, super committee's meeting, they're supposed to come up with their proposal for $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction by the 23rd of November, which is not too far away. And the concern is if oil and gas tax preferences are going to be put on the chopping block, which is, I think, first of all, the right question to ask. My answer may not be the most substantive. First of all, I'm not sure the super committee is going to make any decisions. I think that they may end up failing to. They may. I'm not saying they will. I think there's a plausible scenario that the super committee comes up with no final package to deal with the deficit reduction. And as you all may recall, the legislation that passed that created the super committee said if you don't do something, then by December 23rd, these automatic cross-the-board cuts come in for Medicare and defense. It was designed to be very painful, these automatic cuts, to force this committee to work together. I'm just not so sure that that's going to happen with that committee. So my first answer to you before we get into the specifics of oil and gas is I'm not sure this committee is going to do anything anyway. But they may. And actually, I hope they do, as long as they do the right thing. The second thing that's a challenge to the super committee, if you think about this, in terms of our deficit, is they've got a pretty short time frame. They're not going to reform Medicare by November 23rd. And yet reform of Medicare is a critical long-term issue if we're ever getting a handle on our deficit. They're not going to reform Medicaid. Same thing. Got to do that if we're going to deal with our deficit. This grouping can do that by November 23rd. We need to reform our tax code. I think a lower rates, flatter system is gaining steam, that concept in Washington, quite frankly, on both sides of the aisle. But they're not doing that by November 23rd. Social Security needs to be reformed if it wants to be sustainable over the long run, if you want to fix the deficit problem. I don't think they're doing that by November 23rd. I've just given you four areas that are big opportunities for deficit reduction, but the reality is I suspect that a less than 60 days from now time frame probably prohibits significant action on any of those four big opportunities for deficit reduction. So then you're saying, well, gosh, if that's the case, what do we do to get this 1.2 trillion? Where do we go? And that's why I think they may fail. We may go to these across-the-board cuts. If they do, as I said before, I think we'd be making a bad decision to, particularly in an economic downturn, but I'd say in any economic circumstance, to tell the oil and gas industry we want to make less incentives for you to make investments here in energy production in the United States of America. That sounds like exactly the wrong thing to do, because what you will do, just to the extent you can, it's not. For a lot of you with bigger operations, money's fungible, and you will say, fine, I will go someplace else. I will go to Canada. I will go wherever, and I will invest my money in energy production in a place where the economic decision makes sense to do that. And we will have less economic activity in this country. We will have less economic activity, which in turn is going to have a negative impact on the federal deficit, quite frankly. So in some ways, I think we'd be a backward policy to do that. So my personal position, of course, says we shouldn't do it. You're asking me, do I think they'll do it anyway? I don't. I just don't. On the other hand, if you're finally on this question, you're asking, what do I think they're going to do? If they do something, I'm not sure what it's going to be. They're going to cobble together a group of things like probably Medicare fraud reduction, which, quite frankly, aren't we all against Medicare fraud? And haven't Congress, and it is a problem, don't get me wrong, but hasn't Congress been talking about Medicare fraud like our whole lifetime? Well, since 1965 when Medicare was created. They're going to come up with some things about auctioning off broadband spectrum to make some money. They're going to cobble together just a portfolio of some different things, many of which may make sense, but I don't think they're going to go big, which is what they really ultimately, as a country, we're going to have to go big if we're going to attack the deficit problem. So I guess that's my answer. Hey, Jeff.
What do you think the prospect is of the Nat Gas Act passing?
You know, that's an interesting issue, and some of you in this room may be familiar with this. You know, there's some folks who are advocating and getting members of Congress to take their name off the Natural Gas Act as a co-sponsor. Some folks who are more focused on the oil side than the gas side are now saying, don't do this. So we've reached a little bump in the road, even in the House of Representatives, on what was a really significant bipartisan group. Like almost 200 people had signed onto this bill. And now some people are coming off. And I'm nervous about that, to be honest. So I might have given you a more positive answer when you asked what are the chances 3 months ago, perhaps, than I am today. And I think that's really unfortunate because, as I said earlier, for all the other ideas that really help us, this is one that does not require a technological advancement at all. It's simply an infrastructure issue. How does this country move to where, like in Utah, we have a lot of natural gas fueling stations already, but most of the country doesn't? And how do we move to where we have assembly line production of vehicles that run on natural gas? Again, an infrastructure challenge. And the Natural Gas Act creates a lot of pretty significant incentives to encourage that to happen. So I'd like to see it happen, but Jeff, to be honest, I don't like the chances right now because some people are getting off the bill.
Thank you. Congressman, I looked at the brochure here a little bit and I was confused, and perhaps you can help me clarify it. I don't know whether you wrote it or your staff, so that puts you in an awkward position. But I'm a proponent of oil shale, and I think you've indicated a favorable attitude towards the development of shale. There's a statement in this that says Matheson included a provision in the House-passed energy bill that lifts the moratorium on oil shale leasing in Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming if the state enacts a law to support commercial leasing. So could you explain what that?
Sure. This was in the weeds a little on a bill related to oil shale development, where there was a bill moving through Congress that was going to take away oil shale leasing. And I said, listen, if we can't get it everywhere, we want states to be able to opt in. I will admit being totally parochial and having a Utah perspective. If Colorado and Wyoming didn't want to, that was their decision. But I decided, because the bill was going the wrong way, that I would modify the bill, which I did with an amendment that created this opt-in opportunity for states to say, well, we still want to do it here. And so that was the bill that went through the House of Representatives. This was in I've got to remember, it was either 2007, 2008, and so that was the idea behind the bill. I didn't want to say just one state should be doing it. It's just I was facing a situation where perhaps leasing wasn't going to happen at all, and I figured, I would assume, that Utah would have voted to opt in, and I want to at least give our state the option to do that. So that was the substance. No, the issue on this is that the Senate didn't move that bill. The House moved that bill, the Senate didn't do it. That's a common theme in Washington these days, in case you didn't know about our Senate. Anybody else? Okay, well, yeah. The short answer is I don't think it's going through Congress, first of all. Don't know what his specific proposals are. I am wary of where this department is going. To be just totally candid with you, they've told me one thing and then they go out and do another thing. And so I'm very wary. I'm a big believer, I'll just repeat what I said earlier, in my lifetime, I've seen a lot of emotion and a lot of rhetoric about public lands discussions in Utah and not much progress. And I think that it's amazing what you can do if you get people sitting around a table with a lot of different points of view and they can say, you know what, we actually can agree on a lot of things. And as I said, I'd like to think Washington County Lands Bill represents one example of that process. So I've made it real clear in my conversations with the department and with the secretary that I think this should be a Utah-driven process for lands in Utah, that we value our lands, that we think we have great opportunities here. And by the way, I think what great tradition, you mentioned hunting and the sportsman tradition in Utah is something that I think we also all really value in this room. We really do. I don't know of anyone in this room who doesn't value that tradition. So I think, you know, we want to enact policies that are not negative toward that particular activity. But I do think that when you start talking about monument designation, stuff like that, that kind of gets the hair on the back of my neck going up, and I'd be very resistant to seeing that happen. So, okay. Yeah, John, how you doing? Yeah.
Taking into consideration that the wildlands deal stopped public land bills across the state from moving. I mean, commissioners and the people in this state would do public land bills to resolve the issues so that we had a future, knew where we could work.
Yep.
But every time we start working forward, there's no resolve. Nobody wants to put any final statement in there for release of the other lands so that we've got a place that we can work, support our citizens.
John, the answer is, first of all, you mentioned the wildlands policy, and as you know, the House of Representatives passed an amendment, which I supported, which pulled any funding for implementing that, and that policy now has tended to fade away because of congressional action, in my opinion. Look, you're asking a hypothetical about a monument designation. I'm just saying I think there would be strong discouragement for the president on his own. I always said when we created the monument before in Utah, that's not the way you make public policy decisions, where one person with the stroke of a pen says this is what we're doing. I just don't think that's the way you make public policy decisions. I don't think that's the way, whether it's your county commission, that's not the way they make decisions. They get input from people. The three of them have to vote, by the way. It's not one person. And you got at least two of them to agree on something to affect policy, for example. So whether it's the county government or the United States government, I don't think it's the right way to make policy. And particularly in the case of these issues that, as I said earlier, have created a lot of emotion, a lot of rhetoric over the years, but not a lot of progress. Let me just say one more thing on this too. I don't like the way these issues on public lands often get reduced to two-dimensional arguments. There are actually a lot of points of view about public lands in Utah. That's sort of what multiple use argues for. When we had our discussions of stakeholder interests in Washington County, we had 23 different stakeholder groups around the table. 23 different points of view. And we didn't have extractive industries there. So you could have even more here. And so I think sometimes these arguments oversimplify what is really a more complicated issue at one level, but also one where when people sit around the table and talk about specific parcels of land, they can actually make some pretty pragmatic decisions with each other about resolving them. It's hard work. It took 5 years for Washington County. I don't want to act like this is easy. This is hard to do, but it's doable. It's doable. And the beauty of it is it sets a path forward where people can plan and make decisions and have certainty. And it's not just about what is protected or what's not. It's a much broader issue when you talk about public lands. Where are you going to put corridors for utilities? Where are you going to put corridors for roads? You know, all those decisions that these commissioners struggle with every day about how they're planning for the future of Uintah County, for example. You can lay out this plan. And if you can get everyone to kind of think long-term and identify that, it creates a situation where there's less uncertainty. And I'll guarantee everyone in this room, I haven't been here all day. I've been out doing some other meetings. I bet at some point today there's been some discussion about one of the frustrations you all feel is uncertainty. I bet that happened. It's a big problem right now in our economy in a lot of sectors, by the way, is uncertainty. And Washington, D.C.'s created a certain amount of it, no doubt about it. But what I'm suggesting is if we could resolve some of these issues with locally driven processes on lands bills, I think we could at least peel off some of the uncertainty that all of us face. And it would create a playing field where we could have, you know, a playing field that would be more conducive to making decisions. And so that's what I think, that's the way we ought to be making these decisions. So I've repeated myself on that a couple of times, but anybody else? If that's the case, I just, yeah, we got one more. Yeah.
Maurice Hinchy is proposing the Red Rocks bill. What are we doing to stop him from creating, this policy, and he doesn't even know what we deal with here?
Sure. Well, first of all, the bill's not going to come up for a vote. I can just make that prediction with almost absolute certainty. And if it doesn't come up for a vote, then he's not making policy. I can tell you also that we had a hearing in Congress before the House Resources Committee on the Red Rock proposal. I'm trying to remember, this was a couple of years ago. And at that time, Director Abbey, the head of the BLM, testified. And he said, I don't think we should be doing these statewide wilderness bills. I think the process should be more like the Washington County lands bill that was done by Senator Bennett and Congressman Matheson. This was the testimony of the Department of Interior, which was why the wildlands proposal that came out a few months later was so frustrating to me, because it was like complete reversal from encouraging a bottom-up, locally driven process, saying, no, we're going to do top-down. But that was what happened when we had the hearing on the bill. And since then, no other hearings have been scheduled, and I don't think there's going to be a vote. And I'm not saying don't worry about it. Anytime there's a proposal out there, you need to respond and react and understand it and talk about it. So I'm not saying you shouldn't worry about it at all, but I would submit in this case, I don't think this is coming up for a vote. And I don't think there's anyone, well, I know there is no one in the Utah delegation who's supporting it. So that should, one would think, might inhibit the ability of that bill to ever move. So. Okay. Did you have a question? Yeah, go ahead. I can't think we're done, and then one more stands up.
I've been pleased with what you said about the positive thing you said about extraction of oil and gas and all that kind of stuff. But the question I have is, if you were in front of an environmentalist group, what would you say to them?
Well, I don't know if you know me too well. I think there's a lot of people in this room who do know me too well, and I'd say exactly what I just said now. Because, I was taught by my mom and dad in terms of public policy and discussion, just say what you think. Nobody's going to agree with you on everything, but you don't give a different answer to different sets of people. You just say what you think and let the chips fall where they may. So.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thanks for the invitation.